My name is Kyle Browning. As Amelia said, I'm an assistant director at GAO, and it's my first time here. I'm very happy to be here. Compared to, some other folk, everyone here probably, relatively new to this issue area and to the topic of asset management. But one thing I've already learned in my limited experience in this topic is that agencies and organizations are regularly confronted with new and emerging issues, climate change, pandemics, that hopefully their asset management processes are prepared to address, but sometimes require maybe changes to those asset management processes. So we thought we'd kind of cover three recent GAO reports that talk about some emerging issues that agencies are confronting as they manage their space and their assets. So I think we can go to the second slide, Crystal. So the context for this review that I'm going to talk about is some things that I think you all know, but I think are worth stating as a baseline, which is that climate-related events and other natural hazards present huge risks to federal agencies' management of their real property. They can impose substantial costs. Climate change and natural disasters have cost the federal government billions of dollars in recent years. This graphic isn't necessarily cost to the federal government, but just illustrates a snapshot of 1 year of huge disaster that have those kind of costs. And so limiting the federal government's exposure by better managing climate change risks has been a GAO high risk area since 2013, in part because of the federal government's role in owning and operating a lot of infrastructure. Related, but in a somewhat distinct topic, is that agencies' management of real property can also affect communities where these properties are located. Adverse health and environmental conditions, like the risks from climate change or natural disasters, can in some cases disproportionately burden some communities. So concerns about these disproportionate burdens have led to environmental justice efforts. So this report that I'm talking about does talk about environmental justice in addition to climate vulnerabilities. So again, a little more context before I get into our report, but I think it's worth mentioning that we had a report right before this that actually Amelia led that looked at how selected agencies have incorporated natural disaster resilience into their assets and asset management. That report found that agencies were taking some limited actions to incorporate resilience into their asset management. But if I could summarize it maybe too simplistically, this wasn't really a deeply ingrained part of agencies' asset management yet. Subsequent to that, and in some ways in response to our report, the Disaster Resiliency Planning Act was enacted in December 2022. And this, among other things, required OMB issue guidance to require agencies to consider climate change and resilience as they carry out their real property asset management. So we, from GAO, thought, of course, that was a good thing. That was something that we thought agencies could do better at, and OMB could take some leadership on. So that happened. And so now we can get into a little of what we found in this report. So I think we're on slide 3 now. So the bottom line of the most recent report we put out on this is that agencies are doing better. They're doing more to think about and address climate vulnerabilities and environmental justice as part of their asset management. So the first part of our report talked about how do you even identify climate vulnerabilities? How are agencies doing that? The real quick answer is that they're using federal tools and data to identify their vulnerabilities and their environmental justice considerations that are appropriate for their agencies. These are tools that, and I can talk about this more maybe in the discussion point. These are tools that include data, interactive graphics, maps, and other things that show past and projected climate conditions. Agencies can overlay their own data onto that and then sort of get a sense of what their vulnerabilities are. Additionally, among the agencies review, we reviewed the processes at 13 different agencies. They're also using these tools to identify environmental justice considerations. They specifically called out the climate and economic justice screening tool, which I'm happy to talk about more if people don't know what that is or want to talk more about it. But that's a tool that is available to agencies. That's sort of a geospatial mapping tool that allows them to overlay data with disadvantaged communities. And this has really helped them identify where they need to be thinking more about environmental justice considerations. The challenge, I know there's a lot, but one challenge that came up pretty consistently when we went through agencies' identification of climate vulnerabilities and stuff is there's a lot of tools. How do we pick among all these tools, and what data can we trust, and how do we know what to do and what data to incorporate into our asset management? And luckily, there's been some action to help with that in the last couple of years. I won't go into depth on all of this, but for example, the White House's Office of Science and Technology policy issued guidance that provided some information for federal agencies to help select among these resources and tools. The OMB guidance that I mentioned from the law in December 2022, that came out in November 2023. That OMB guidance also helps agencies pick, it first identifies a lot of these tools, also helps agencies pick what might be appropriate for them and provides some guidance on, evaluating the data. Just anecdotally, we've seen that sometimes these tools are very good, but the data doesn't reflect what's happening right now. You can look at what happened with the hurricane in Western North Carolina. Some of those flooding were things that were never anticipated by existing tools and maps on climate projections. So evaluating the data and the tools is an important thing for agencies to be doing as well. So next slide, I think, slide 4. All the next thing we looked at was sort of, okay, now that you've, as an agency, identify what your vulnerabilities might be, how do you incorporate that into asset management? And again, as a high level quick summary that maybe we could go in more depth on during discussion is that agencies are, all 13 that we talked to, are incorporating climate vulnerabilities as one factor among others into their existing real property asset management processes. As you all probably know, what this often involves for agencies is ranking potential investments and incorporating climate vulnerability among other factors is something agencies are doing now pretty consistently. Again, something that we're looking for agencies to be doing, and we saw sort of at all 13 agencies that we looked at. As a side note, we didn't make this part of our report evaluative, in large part because the space was evolving in real time as we were doing this audit work, primarily because the law had just passed requiring agencies to do this. Some agencies were already doing it, but some were sort of ramping it up. OMB guidance hadn't come out yet, so we sort of wanted to just do a snapshot of where agencies were rather than evaluate them based on a moving target. So as a side note. It might go without saying, but another thing we heard as part of this part of the report was that, of course, other considerations can conflict sometimes with the agency's efforts to address climate vulnerabilities. Sometimes mission criticality for a facility or an asset can trump any climate mitigation efforts that an agency might want to do, or there might be health and safety alterations or considerations that an agency deems are more important. That's part of a normal part, I think, of the asset management process, is to weigh different competing priorities. But we certainly didn't hear that agencies were able to or even willing to address all climate vulnerabilities for their asset management. So that, frankly, would be an unrealistic goal anyways. And then next slide, slide 5. With respect to environmental justice considerations, we also heard that agencies are identifying considerations and trying to incorporate that into their asset management as well. I would characterize this as less developed than the agency's climate vulnerability work. For example, what we heard agencies most often doing was altering and changing and enhancing their NEPA requirements. So as many of you probably know, NEPA requires environmental reviews agencies to carry out for a lot of investments in construction. And there's things that agencies can do through that to try to address environmental justice considerations. So just as a quick example to try to make this sort of maybe nebulous concept more concrete, we heard from the Department of Homeland Security that it had updated its instruction manual for implementing NEPA at the agency. And what it specifically started to require their employees to do and the processes to carry out were outreach efforts to populations affected by investments, by new construction or renovations or things like that. And they also use those tools I mentioned before to identify any disadvantaged or overburdened populations that might be affected by things and ensure that they're reaching out, they're getting their input, and potentially altering plans in response to that input. And the last thing I'll say on this is that, again, in the course of our work, GSA issued a final rule in April 2024 that describes the factors that federal agencies should consider when making location decisions for federal facilities. And one of those factors is environmental justice considerations. So it says specifically in this new rule that agencies should seek to minimize negative and maximize positive impacts in communities affected by environmental justice concerns. I think agencies are probably still grappling with that and figuring out how they're going to implement that. But that was another emerging requirement that we saw in response to this environmental justice concern.